Murders are always disturbing, but some are even worse than that. These killings were brutal, almost unimaginable in their depravity. The crimes horrified communities and stunned others, leaving cushions that are lingered for decades afterwards, as years passed without an arrest or even a credible suspect. Here are top 3 mysterious unsolved murders. The February 9 killer. On February 9, in a suburb of Salt Lake City, an Hispanic woman was attacked and murdered while alone in her apartment. Incredibly, the same thing happened twice, in both 2006 and 2008, and though at first the repeated circumstances were taken to be a grisly coincidence, DNA analysis of evidence collected at both scenes would later prove that the murder was committed by the same man, whom the media promptly dubbed the February 9 killer. In the 2006 case, the victim Sonia Major was pregnant when she was assaulted and strangled. A few items were stolen from her apartment, but none of them ever turned up. In the 2008 case, Damiana Castillo was strangled in her apartment about a mile away from Mejia's place. In both cases, there were no sign of forced entry, and while the investigative agencies involved were and are still extremely reluctant to be labeled serial killer, they certainly seem to be an apt description of a man who kills 2 women in a very similar fashion on the same date 2 years apart. While police have a vague description of the killer, they are not saying how they arrived at it, and while they have a DNA profile, they don't have a match for the profile. The Monster of Florence. Between 1968 and 1985, a monster stalked the streets of Florence in Italy. He or she wielded a .22 caliber pistol, murdering 16 people before inexplicably vanishing. The killer almost struck every couple, and police have been utterly stymied in their attempts to definitely solve the case. Over the course of the investigation, they interviewed more than 100,000 people. 4 different men have been convicted of the murders at 4 different times, and of course, they can't be guilty of all the murders. Many others have arrested in connection with the crimes, not only to be released when the killer struck again using the same gun and modus operandi. Independent investigations have carried at the conclusion that Antonio Vinci, a relative of 2 other suspects in the murder, is likely a culprit. Vinci is still alive and free, and in 2008 maintained his innocence in a Dateline NBC interview. Whoever the monster is, or was, a resolution seems highly unlikely near 30 years after the last murder occurred. The Bible John. In the late 1960s, 3 young Scottish women met their ends at the hands of a scripture quoting murderer who came to be known as Bible John. All of the victims were strangled with their own stockings. Jean Puttock, sister of the victim Helen Puttock, was being able to provide the only description of the killer after sharing a taxi with him for an hour. The man had identified himself as John Templeton and had exclusively quoted from the Bible, and even referred to the type of dance halls in which he met his victims as dens of iniquity. After Jean and her dirt exited the cab, Helen continued on with John, only to be found dead in the next morning. The man disappeared without a trace. If you have enjoyed this video, subscribe for more.